Welcome to Casual Politics, Lord Morris. Thank you very much for accepting my request. You need no introduction. You've been Member of Parliament from 1959 to 2001, and now you're sitting in the House of Lords, and you were Minister of State for Defence under Wilson, and Secretary of State for the West Secretary under Callaghan, and the Attorney General under Tony Blair. You've served under five different Labour leaders. So the first question is, why did you decide to stand in 1959 general election?
I'd always been interested in politics since a young boy. I didn't really appreciate what it all meant, but I wanted to combine two careers, that of being a barrister and a Member of Parliament, and a Member of Parliament in Wales. And when the opportunity came, I stood for a nomination, lost 2 nominations, and eventually won Aberavon, which was a marvellous seat with 18,000 majority, and I fought 11 elections there.
And 1950s, it was a new era. We had the Cold War, we had just emerged from the Second World War, and some gigantic, monumental figures that were seen in Parliament, such as Churchill, Rab Butler, and the others. So what did you make of them?
Well, they were very great figures because they had been ministers, Prime Minister in Churchill's case, during the war. And Butler had been Minister of Education during the war and had been a junior minister in the Foreign Office before the war. So they had long experience and had fought very, very hard to preserve the freedom in this country. I remember Butler taking part in many debates. Churchill, of course, never spoke. He was very wise enough not to speak. But I travelled in a lift with him on one occasion, and the whole house stopped in awe when he arrived at the bar of the house, which is the entrance to the house. And of course he had no physical support from there to where he sat on the front bench below the gangway. And when he had safely got there and sat down, then the business went on.
Very interesting. And also, back in 1959, your leader was Hugh Gaitskell, and he was quite Eurosceptic. He, along Atlee, they were amongst the first Eurosceptics in your party. So how did you get along with Hugh Gaitskell?
Oh, very well. He promoted me to the front bench within 2 years, and on defence. And I spoke on agriculture and on the steel industry. But he was my first leader who gave me my first job in Parliament, for which I'm very grateful. Intellectually, of course, he was superb. And I heard his great speech in Scarborough when he said he would fight and fight and fight again for the party that he loved. It was a terrible tragedy that both he and my other hero, Aneurin Bevan, died so quickly, one after the other. And I remember Aneurin Bevan speaking in the House. He was past his prime, he was still in great force. I remember him taking part in a great by-election in Carmarthen at the time of the Suez War. And then he was intellectually and stimulating and very strong man. And then, of course, he went downhill so rapidly, we didn't notice him going downhill. And he died. And there were great losses to the Labour Party.
To the Labour movement as well.
Yeah.
And had Hugh Gaitskell remained your party leader, would have he won the 1964 general election in your view?
Oh, I think so, yes. Because the time was ripe then for a change in government, and there was a momentum. And Harold Wilson benefited from that. I supported him in the election to become leader when my first nominee, Jim Callaghan, didn't get enough votes. And I became, although I was much, much younger, I became, I think, a man that Wilson trusted. He once said, I was a safe pair of hands. And he gave me 4 jobs: transport, power and defence. And eventually, to my surprise and surprise of everybody else, my country, Wales in particular, I became the Secretary of State for Wales, which was a very great honour for a Welshman. And I was there for 6 long years.
And I think some of our viewers, they would remember one of the biggest scandals in British politics. It was the Profumo affair.
Yes.
So do you remember when he gave a speech in which he misled the House and eventually he had to resign following that speech? What were your thoughts at that time surrounding his speech and his misleading?
Well, as a defence spokesman, we locked horns in parliamentary questions. I was a junior spokesman. I looked after the army. So I knew Jack as an opponent. He was very good at the dispatch box. And I happened by accident to be there on that Friday when he made his statement to the House. Normally I was not there on a Friday. I was in my constituency in Wales, but I happened to be there. And another member said Profumo was going to make a great statement. So I rushed in and heard him. And I'm sorry to say I believed him, as the House did.
Mm-hmm. And you were probably disappointed.
Well, yeah, I was surprised.
The
That way.
revelations.
Yes, I was surprised, but I knew nothing about it. Not a field that I turned in as a very young member of Parliament, fairly newly married, and didn't move in those circles. No, I was astonished, really, and it was a major interest at the time. And then Lord Denning, the great judge, held his inquiry, very peculiar inquiry, almost a private inquiry, and published his report. It was a huge amount. It was probably the best-selling stationery office report of all time, really. I remember it vividly, and the revelations, which everybody was surprised.
But his resignation was a good news to your party and then Harold Macmillan's resignation followed, and then the downfall of the Conservative Party came after.
Yes, I'm not sure how we actually benefited from that. I mean, it was an interest to many people, but I don't think it had any great political significance. It was over and done with, and these scandals do happen from time to time, not only in politics but in the world generally, and then you get on with the next battle. No, we might have had some benefit, but I don't think very much. I think that I think the Macmillan resignation, which was a surprise, and then Douglas Hume, the 14th Earl of Hume, who didn't seem to know much about decimal points when he tried to make his contribution. I think we won because we deserved to win at that time on our policies.
So why didn't it take Wilson 4 years to promote you to his cabinet, to his government as the Minister of State for Defence?
Well, I was in 1964. I was a junior Minister of Transport in the first days of the government. I was there for a year and a half, and then Barbara Castle wanted a change of junior ministers, and I went over there to become the junior Minister for Transport, one of the two, and I chaired a major inquiry into the finances of British Rail, and then that was welcomed by the Cabinet, and I had a lovely letter from the Prime Minister. And then when the vacancy occurred in the Ministry of Defence, which was a super ministry to serve in, and quite a senior job, it was the Senior Minister of State, well, I think I was promoted as fast as could be.
And how was it to work along with the great Denis Healey, who was your boss?
It was a complete change, because Barbara Castle and I worked, as it were, in each other's pockets. We had discussions every day on something or other, and she was a great boss, absolutely wonderful. I learned everything in politics, how to be a minister, from her. And then when I went to Denis Healey, his style was completely different. He was a double first in classics. intellectually a very clever man. And instead of seeing your boss every day, almost, I saw him by appointment every month. Quite different. He let me I looked after the whole of the equipment of the Air Force, the Army and the Navy. And he told you what to do, the lines to follow, and you got on with it. And that was a wonderful I was very young still. I was still in my 30s. Because I was in the Privy Council at 39. So you can't complain about speed.
And the great Denis Healey, I did his last interview, and then when I asked him if he regretted of never becoming Foreign Secretary and eventually Prime Minister, and then he said the cabinet, it was split between two groups of people, one group who thought that he was already Foreign Secretary and the other one who thought that he would be promoted to the Foreign Office one day. Was that the case in the cabinet?
I really don't know. I know he was a great minister, whatever he did. And he had a very tough time as Chancellor of the Exchequer. He probably was disappointed that Tony Cosland was made unexpectedly Foreign Secretary, and then David Owen afterwards, which was a huge surprise. Well, there it is. I mean, he held the great offices of state. He was a defence minister for 6 years and the Chancellor of the Exchequer for I don't know how many years, it was a long time. And had very difficult times with the financial situation being in dire stress and the IMF moving in. We had 5 or 6 cabinet meetings in 2 days at that stage. I'll never forget them. I was absolutely exhausted.
And then in 1974, when the Wilson government came back, he promoted you to the Welsh office as the Welsh Secretary. So what were the problems that you were facing as Secretary of State in those days?
Well, there are 2 aspects to the job of Secretary of State. You were the minister for almost everything. Not quite. So you have the day-to-day bread and butter issues of jobs, of industry, of local government, of health, and of education. And they were the bread and butter jobs which took most of your time. But at the same time, it was a flagship decision of the government, led by Wilson, and only because of Wilson, that we had devolution as our major legislation. The Royal Commission had been set up, and the first Lord Crowther and then Lord Kilbrandon, to look at the future constitution of Scotland and Wales. And I was a great supporter. I was a devolutionist since 1953, since I was 23 years old. When I was a student at Cambridge, I was going to study as part of my master's the Stormont government. So I've been heavily involved in devolution, and I refer to the history of it in the speech I made on the Wales Bill a fortnight ago in the House in the second reading, where I've been involved for so many years, and I was given the job because the alternative, Mr. George Thomas, later Viscount Tolopandi, was anti-devolution. And
eventually became the Speaker of the House.
Eventually became Speaker of the House. But to his surprise, he had been Secretary of State for Wales. And to his great surprise, and everybody else's surprise, including me, I got a job and he didn't get a job. He had to go off and become Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means, which is a Deputy Speaker, to, I suspect, great disappointment and surprise, because he was a very close friend of Harold Wilson. But I had a job, and the major problem then was to steer the devolution bill through the House of Commons and the Scottish one as well. And eventually we had the referendum, and I had the biggest black eye of all times when it was rejected by 4-1 by my nation. And eventually I lived and survived. It was a government decision. I came very close to resignation. But
the government didn't survive.
Well, and eventually, no. But I survived in the job
Yes.
for a couple of months until we had the election. And then the Scottish nationalists voted against us in a vote of confidence, although they'd got great deal of what they wanted. And I remember Callaghan as Prime Minister then making the speech that they were like turkeys voting for Christmas. And they were, and they lost 2/3 of their seats in the election. So it didn't do them any good. But we had to wait then 18 years then, under Prime Minister Thatcher and other Prime Ministers, until eventually Tony Blair became Prime Minister. And we had another devolution bill. And became Attorney General and was on the Cabinet Committee steering it through. I was not a policy maker, I was the chief legal advisor to the government. And I had the great privilege of seeing the bill pass and winning another referendum narrowly, and then going down to Cardiff for the first meeting of the Welsh Assembly as Attorney General, and presenting a copy of the bill, a dummy copy of the bill, to Her Majesty the Queen for signature in English and Welsh. And that was a culmination of my, I think, political career.
Mm. And you mentioned those wilderness years. What were your thoughts surrounding that the Labour, instead of fighting the Tories, they were fighting themselves? What that it is happening at the moment now?
I'm not sure. Politicians always disagree. They eventually have to reach a consensus, and that is the job of the Prime Minister of the day, to try to get a consensus. Nothing is new in politics.
But the fighting between the two fractions within the Labour Party, it became very evident and obvious to everyone. It's happening at the moment.
Well, yes. At the moment it's a pretty awful position when the leader hasn't got the confidence of members of Parliament. But
is that a novelty for you?
I think that is a novelty. I think yes. But when we had Irene Bevan and Harold Wilson and John Freeman resigning, there were very bitter arguments then for many years, until Irene Bevan decided that we had to have a nuclear arms, because he said, I cannot, as British Foreign Secretary, go to the councils of the world and discuss defence naked. And he was convinced eventually that security of the nation was paramount. This is probably the same problem now, that I think eventually it has been agreed that there is no change in the Labour Party policy, but there are some doubts as regards the views of the leader, considerable doubts. But the position of the Labour Party is that we have to replace Trident, that is the party policy, and we have to ensure the security of the nation. But these arguments have been going on as long as I remember.
And you served, as I said previously, under 5 different leaders. So, but who was the one who had the right vision, the right direction, and also who was the real Labour man, in your view?
Well, you ask a number of questions. Harold Wilson, I think, was the greatest of our Prime Ministers. He was a very great figure and a very clever man. He had been President of the Board of Trade at the age of 32, and he steered his government through very difficult times. Callaghan was a close personal friend of mine, and I have great admiration for him. Tony Blair is a different era to myself. I became his Attorney General. It was a privilege, but I'm afraid that I was sometimes the fifth wheel of the coach, in the sense that I maintained the rule of law and the supremacy of the law, and took things very, very carefully indeed. I was very pleased I was not the Attorney General during the Iraq War.
and were you and about the Chilcot inquiry? What were your
Sorry?
thoughts? Your thoughts about the Chilcot inquiry?
Well, the Chilcot inquiry,
Is it relevant?
in my view, was analysed the situation, didn't reach too many conclusions. It might have been clearer. It took an awful long time when eventually the memory of people faded away and people didn't know what the inquiry was about.
It was very costly
Eh?
as well. Very costly.
Very costly, yes, enormous cost,
Mm.
20 million or whatever. I was trying to demand that the inquiry come to a head. But the government was saying the inquiry is independent. Well, up to a point it is. But they should have reported to Parliament long before on whatever conclusions they had then come to on an interim basis. You can't let an inquiry like the Londonderry inquiry have complete free rein to go on forever. And the same thing now with the historical sex inquiry. I doubt very much whether I shall see it reporting. I may be lucky to be alive, but I'll be sheer luck really, because I've been trying to persuade the government to change the terms of reference so that there are 10 or 12 different inquiries which can be handled and report in time, because there are victims who want to know, the public want to know. We want to ensure what lessons have been learned. But I failed so far because, unfortunately, I believe the Prime Minister, having set it up when she was Home Secretary, and the present Home Secretary, who has no experience of setting up inquiries, dare not depart from the party line.
Mm.
So we are sunk really, and they've spent a colossal sum already, and there's no hope it will report.
Mm. You had 3 chairs. We had 3 different chairs, and they all resigned.
Yeah.
And the new chair, do you think, because she's determined to come to a conclusion eventually?
Well, she has a good track record.
Yeah.
She's well regarded, and I wish her well. But I think her task is mission impossible.
Mm.
She should have, in my view, stood firm and say, please amend the terms of reference. She lost her counsel to the inquiry, the junior counsel, and everybody else has resigned because this is the last thing that the Dame Goddard said, was that the task was impossible.
Mm.
I mean, when so many people reach the view that the task is impossible, why do you keep on banging your head against the wall?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is the question. And so do you think, and the Met Police as well, they have, there were lots of criticisms actually of the Met Police and their handling of the child sex inquiry.
Yeah, well, I had a question 2 days ago in the House of Lords, and I think manifest injustice can be done to persons where their names are published before they are charged. And the government have a mantra that there may be operational reasons why the name should be given. I think they should be much more strictly defined. I think it's gravely unjust for people to be named when eventually it turns out there is no evidence for them to be charged. I mean, the idea of Field Marshal Bramwell's home being raided and his wife severely ill, and trying to explain how every room in the house and every computer was being looked at to her, and then not having a proper apology for a long time. And likewise, Leon Britton dying before he knew he was cleared. And the case of Mr. Ted Heath, Sir Edward Heath, the policeman standing...
Do you believe those allegations against him?
Sorry?
Do you believe those allegations against him?
Well, it's not for me to believe. It's for the court to believe. An allegation is an allegation. I'm a criminal lawyer. I don't have to believe anything, but I want to ensure that everyone has justice. and everyone is innocent until he's proved guilty. And for having a policeman standing outside the gates of Ted Heath's home when he was alive, he being dead, come along and tell us what you know about him. And there was nothing known. I mean, I think that is manifestly unjust to blacken a man, because people will say there's no smoke without fire. It's an old English adage. No, I think the system, and I've written today to the Law Commission and to the Justice Committee of the House of Commons, asking them to consider the matter, because I think this is an appalling situation of people being maligned in this way, and eventually, a long time afterwards, when they've lived under a cloud, then they're exonerated, reluctantly in some cases. I think this is appalling. It offends my sense of justice. And I'm primarily a lawyer, and I practiced the criminal law over a period of 50 years.
How would you have handled it if you were in charge?
Well, first of all, I would change the practice, and it is practice, not law, that you don't reveal names unless in dire circumstances when some national crisis is involved. You get the evidence and charge people. You don't have people hanging on a string for everyone to pelt coconuts at them. And that's what I would have done. I would have instructed the police, you do not give names until there is a charge. And you only charge when there is evidence. I mean, that's English law. It's the fundamental precept of our law, going back to Magna Carta.
And and also you've been a PS since 2001. So what are your thoughts regarding the private members' bill of one of your colleagues last week about how to reform the second chamber?
Well, I don't think that's the way of going about it, really. That bill will come to nothing. It'll be discussed. There'll never be a consensus. First of all, I don't believe, and I want to find out, what is the authority for the Prime Minister to, not only Cameron, but the others as well, to pack the House of Lords with their nominees. I believe it is fundamentally undemocratic. The House has become far too big, I concede that. But there is a better way of doing it. And what I would do is this. I want to ensure there is no clash between the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And if you elect members of Parliament, which is, members of the House of Lords, which is one way of tackling it, you will inevitably get a clash. And I was in Washington a few years ago when there was the gridlock between the Senate and Congress, because both had authority. There was I in that awfully hot weekend in September when they were gridlocked and nobody could go home. I don't want to see a situation like that. I believe the House of Commons is paramount and the House of Lords is only a reviewing chamber. And there is a simple way of tackling the issue, and that is by altering the Parliament Act to ensure that the House of Lords can only delay discussion for a relatively short period of time. And whatever they vote, against or not, of a bill, for it will go back to the House of Commons, the House of Lords having made their views known, the House of Commons to consider them, then for the bill to go straight, without any need to delay the matter to the Parliament Act, to the Queen for signature, and for it to become law of the land. The simplest way of tackling it, and then you'd only need a very small, relatively small House of Lords, who would have expertise in their own field, and would be able to review legislation, make their views known. I mean, that's the start line. And that would remove the need for an elected chamber, because there would be a couple of hundred of people who would have an expertise in order to review, and that's all you need. You do need a second look at legislation. I believe in two chambers. First chamber can make a mistake, and indeed those who are opponents or those who have difficulties with legislation, be it weights and measures or anything else, small issues, you have to have the organizations who could do work the legislation to have the opportunity to have their voice heard. And that's the great value of a bicameral system. You have one house to consider it, make their views known, and then for it to go to the other in order to stall a little when everybody has the opportunity to comment on legislation and see if it's workable or not. But having made their views known, having considered, then to go back to the Commons for them to ensure it becomes part of the law of the land.
The new Lord Speaker, Lord Fowler, in his manifesto to become Lord Speaker, he said that he will pledge to reduce not only the size of the chamber, as you referred to it very rightly, but also the age, because the average age in the second chamber is over 65. So
I think it's 69, I think.
Yeah, 69. So there is a gap between.
Yes, well,
Yeah.
Personally, and I'm biased, of course, I don't think it's relevant. I take a full part at 85 in the proceedings of the House. I do it in the same way as I was doing it in the Commons for 41 years. I asked a question yesterday. I asked another question a week before, and I made a speech the week before that on the second reading of the Wales Bill. Can anyone do more? Is there any need for anyone to speak more than that? I sit on the procedural committee of the House. So far, when the time comes and I feel I cannot make a contribution, then I will avail myself, not yet, of the machinery there is to retire from the House. The machinery is there. More people should avail themselves once they realize they have no contribution to make. But to have just an age barrier, whatever, whether it be 60, 70, 80 or whatever, in itself is not logical. I mean, in the House of Commons you have people who are in their 80s. I know one member, at least, was nearly 82.
Paul Flynn.
Making an active contribution. And is he to be...
And David Winnick is about 83.
David Winnick as well. David Winnick in particular makes a very active contribution on the Home Affairs Committee. And Paul Flynn, whom I've known for a very long time, was on the front bench until a few days ago. So age is not in itself a criteria for membership, unless you make it part of the law of the land that everyone retires at 60 as a civil service too.
There were also some talks about among your colleagues that if the vote on the Article 50 comes to the second chamber, they will try to vote against it and to block it. Do you think is that right to do so?
Well, whatever they do, and I hope common sense prevails, I voted ultimately remain in the last half hour of the time I had to vote because I was voting postally. I'm not sure even now whether I was right or not. But that was a decision of a referendum. I don't like referenda. I've suffered from referenda. But the decision having been taken, there must be an opportunity for Parliament to discuss, debate, and if necessary to vote. But I hope that common sense will prevail and that the electorate who have been given this task of deciding, I don't think they should have been given because it was far too complicated, far too difficult. If I spent all that time trying to decide which way to vote, what about people who didn't have the facility and experience that I have? But I came to a decision eventually. But then we must respect the decision of the people. And there were many issues that concerned people, of which immigration was one. And both parties did not face up to the issue and the concern of ordinary people about immigration. Whether they're right or not, that doesn't matter. But that was one of the main driving forces in my personal view. I may be wrong. But I think Parliament now, being given the opportunity to vote, then they must respect the electorate. Anyone who thinks you can have a second referendum now is exceedingly foolish.
And were you astonished to find out on the day of the referendum that when the results came out that the overwhelming majority in Wales they had supported our exit from the European Union?
Yes, I think we were all surprised, really, because immigration was not the problem there. And I think
Emigration is a problem, or not?
Sorry?
Emigration is a problem in Wales and Scotland, but not immigration.
Well, I'm not sure. No, I mean, there were various factors driving people. I think the one major factor was the feeling of being left behind by Whitehall in the fact that not sufficient alternative industries. I mean, I've seen the coal industry decimated, and I've seen the steel industry and the great problems in the economic paralysis. I think it was concern for jobs and opportunities and being left behind that motivated my people. But I'm not in touch as much as I should be now. But I spoke in Carmarthen last December in a dinner celebrating 50 years of a farmers' union that I, as a very young man, helped to set up as their first legal advisor. And I warned then that if agricultural support from Brussels was taken away, then we would have to revert to what happened during and after the war, and in particular in the Agricultural Act of 1949, whereby the state would have to step in and take over the responsibility for agricultural support. Regrettably, the leadership of both farming unions remained supporters and were blind to the possibility there was another means of financing British agriculture, and there has been that need since 1940. And so I set out then what should happen. And I'm glad to say now that the government have given an indication that there will be support for agriculture. But as it turns out, I think the majority of farmers probably voted to leave because they were engulfed with the bureaucracy of Brussels and the form filling, which was so vital in order to ensure that they got their grants. I think that drove a large number, I will never know how many, to vote for Brexit.
And my final question: after serving over 60 years, your party, so how do you foresee the future of the Labour Party at the moment, and do you think that in your lifetime you will see another Labour government?
It is difficult to foresee a good future for the Labour Party.
Under Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, I think that the present leadership hasn't got a serious hope of winning an election for some time. You never know. There's always a possibility. All I can say is this: in 79, I never envisaged that I would have to wait 18 years when I thought I was in my prime, having been in cabinet for 6 years, that I would have to wait 18 long years before I became, and I was lucky to become a minister again. So if the Labour Party doesn't realize that there's a possibility of another very long time, whether it be 18 or 8 or maybe 5, but there is a substantial period in front of the Labour Party before they can persuade the majority of people that they become a government, as I would hope and pray, in the interest of ordinary people, the people that I represented for 41 years. They deserve and they need a Labour government. But we must face up to the possibility of the repetition of what I had to face 18 long years waiting for Tony Blair to win an election.
We shall wait and see. Well, thank you very much, Lord Morris, for your time.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much.